Politics and art can have an interesting and sometimes fraught relationship with each other. Poets can participate in presidential inaugurations, as has been seen in recent years in the United States, and their role there has been to celebrate the new president and to potentially challenge him to live up to the ideals of America. American songwriters have a history of being more pointed in their critique of political leadership than poets. In ancient Rome and India, sometimes this relationship can be more complicated, especially when it comes to epic poetry. Our guest today, Shubha Pathak, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University, explores the religious and political dynamics of Indian and Roman epic love poetry in antiquity. Unlike in modern Western cultures, religion and politics in ancient India and Rome are not separate, so these dynamics can point to the profound effects of ancient literary art on the upper echelons of ancient culture. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. Well, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So you have a really interesting academic background, so I want to explore that a little bit. So you studied religion as an undergraduate, and then you earned a PhD in social and behavioral sciences.
Yes.
And then you went back and studied religion at the master's level and then got a PhD in history of religion. So
yes.
How does that all work?
Right. So I think part of it was not really having humanities role models as a child, just sort of growing up. I didn't really realize you could sort of have a career in the humanities, I think.
Yeah.
I've always loved stories. I've always loved learning about religion and religions. I come from a Hindu background, and I went to Quaker school growing up, and I'm from Baltimore, where there are a lot of different religious groups interacting.
Yeah.
So I definitely felt sort of drawn to the study of religion at a pretty early age, I think. But at the same time, I was an immigrant. I came over as a baby with my parents from India. And my parents were physicians. And in our household, it was just sort of assumed that I was someone who was pretty academically oriented and pretty compliant with things. And so I think it was just sort of assumed that I was, I'm going to be a physician too. So that was sort of my path as I was completing high school and looking at colleges and things like that. But at the same time, I also wanted to take other courses. I enjoyed writing, and I wanted to be able to have a well-rounded education. So I took a religion course my second semester of college, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was a psychology of religions course. It was on the self and world religions.
Yeah.
So it had comparative angles, and the prof organized it as a sort of team-taught thing where an expert on whatever religion would come in and just talk about that particular theme in the religion.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I started thinking, okay, I have to keep taking these religion courses, I think. So I was taking them, and it wasn't until sophomore year when I had to decide on what to major in. I was thinking about it, and I said, okay, I'm already doing the pre-med requirements. So my choice was basically between molecular biology and religion. So I, was thinking about it, and I had sort of managed science and math all right in high school. But when I got to college, I sort of realized that I wasn't necessarily excelling in those fields. I couldn't handle it, but it wasn't like I was particularly especially gifted in those fields, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas I felt like with religion, it just sort of tapped something in me that I really enjoyed. And I think that sort of was reflected in just my sort of experience of how taking courses was. And I sort of started thinking, I said, okay, well, even if I decide to go to medical school, it would be really good, I think, to be somebody different, not just be like all the other biology majors out there. Because if I can write and I can think and I can do these other things, the sciences will come. I can figure out how to treat people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the other stuff, sort of the critical thinking, reading, writing, I thought, this is a great way to develop those skills.
Yeah.
And enjoy it as well.
That's great. It's you have a rare thing in your background of being equally interested and talented in humanities and sciences. Usually those two are kind of at odds with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily. I don't think sciences come. I mean, I know people for whom sciences are really, really easy, and I'm not one of those people.
Yeah.
Ironically, I think my little brother is. Like he's just somebody who doesn't really need to study a lot, that kind of thing, and he just sort of has this intuitive grasp of things.
Yeah.
But he actually ended up becoming a physician, so that worked out for my parents.
Yeah.
But I ended up actually taking a medical sociology course a junior year of college, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
And it sort of got me thinking, okay, maybe I can combine these two areas and do something relating to sort of the cultural aspects of health and medicine and that kind of stuff. So I decided, instead of going to medical school right out of college, I decided to apply to master's programs at public health schools where I could study cultural stuff, but in sort of a focused way so that it was applied. So my program that I ended up in, I actually was just going to be there for a master's, but after the first year, I kind of realized that I wasn't going to go to medical school. I realized I couldn't really stand the sight of blood. I didn't really want to treat sick people all day.
Yeah.
So those were sort of indicators to me that maybe medicine was not the right field for me to go into.
Right.
I talked to my professors, and a lot of them were encouraging of my writing. You know, they were saying, you know, you've already completed half the requirements for the PhD program. Why don't you just stay? And in that field, as opposed to our field, PhDs are much faster. You know, it's not like a decade commitment or something like that. You're just there for a few years.
Right.
And oftentimes people, one of the things I did, as was pretty common at the time, was I figured out a way to sort of work while I was doing it and get paid for work experience and stuff like that. So that was very useful. But the problem was that I ended up studying. I worked for a company, actually it was part of the university, that did communication campaigns in the developing world. And they were promoting reproductive health, which I was interested in at the time. And one of the things they were doing was figuring out, okay, what things in people's cultures can we bring into our campaign so that they are sensitive and appropriate for the particular area and things like that.
Yeah.
And in the course of studying, I was interested in rural Bangladesh, that area, because of my South Asian background. But when I was studying Bangladesh, I was realizing, oh my gosh, the stuff I'm really enjoying is learning about religion.
Yeah.
You know, like, because it's a majority Muslim country, but there's a Hindu minority, and you know, just thinking about all that and thinking about how to ask people questions about their love lives and things like this, I realized, oh gosh, I'm not quite in the right place.
Yeah.
And so that got me thinking, okay, I think I have to go back and do religion.
Yeah. That's great. We had a student in our department who was a minor. I think she's graduating this year, but she's a neurobiology, neurobiology major. And she took one of my classes, and clearly she knew a lot about the ancient world. And so I convinced her to be a minor.
Great.
It wasn't a hard thing to convince her about, because she saw the value of learning about different religions for her future clinical work in neurology. And I wish more people saw that. There's such a split, it seems. You know, people in humanities don't really understand the value of learning science, and people in science don't always value humanities very much, but it's so needed to have a balance of the two.
I think so. And I think it's getting more polarized now than it was back, I think, when we were going through school. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, definitely. So how did you get interested in epics, and why do you think they're important?
So epics, I started learning about it at a really early age. I was really fortunate. My mom's parents lived with us growing up. So my grandparents were very interested in sort of passing on cultural traditions and things like that. But the things that really stuck with me were stories, because that's what I really enjoyed. And so I remember learning about stories from Sanskrit epics from my grandmother, before I could read, I think. And then in school, I would learn about Greek epics and, you know, be exposed to reading materials about, you know, sort of junior stories about the Odyssey and things like that. And that also was interesting to me. You know, I think anytime I was sort of thinking about how people interacted with forces larger than themselves, I enjoyed that. So, I also I'm not a super well-informed person about this, but I enjoy science fiction too. So I think, you know, just sort of getting out of the physical world, I think, is good for me. I like that.
That's great. So what kind of value do you see them having in today's culture? I mean, other than enjoying the stories, what's the importance of, or why do they survive, basically, other than being entertaining?
Yeah, I had to think about this because I wrote a book on epics. And I sort of learned at an early age with writing that if you're going to use a word over and over again, you should probably figure out what it means. So the first sentence of the book is what an epic is. So it sort of addresses part of that question, I think. So I think the sentence goes something like, an epic is an extended poem written in composed in an elevated style that treats a pivotal epoch in the past of a particular people and endures because it educates audiences in an entertaining way, but also endures because it entertains audiences and it educates them on issues of ultimate importance.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So you've written about epic for a good part of your career,
yeah,
all the way back to graduate school. So how does it relate to your current work on comparison of Roman and Indian epics?
Yeah, so I think initially when I was starting out, I was just sort of trying to get my head around, okay, why do we have these different cultures that have these sort of, not the same, but similar kinds of stories where heroes are trying to figure things out and they're seen as exemplary or not, but in any case, even if they're exploring concerns that are specific to particular cultures, there's some commonality and people tend to group these in the same genre. And epic is a category that makes sense to a lot of people, except maybe modern day advertisers who seem to use it for a lot of different things. But the thing that I sort of realized as I was continuing, I think what ended up happening was I started with the earliest epics in the Greek and Indian traditions. And then once I did that, I realized, okay, I'm going to keep going. I'll just keep studying. I'll just keep getting further and further into the future. So it made sense to go to Rome and then medieval India. And so I was sort of, Kalidas is right before medieval, sort of late classical period. And so I think the main shift there was from collectively authored epics to individually authored epics. And the exciting thing about individual authors, as you know, is that you can actually figure out when they lived.
Yeah.
And you can say, oh, wow, you actually have a historical context that I can really, really delve into.
Right.
And so I think that kind of made it possible for me to think about what types of work these epics were doing that was different from those sort of societal types of creations that seem to be very broad and far-ranging in their focus. This was more particularized and could actually reflect a person's life and how they were getting on.
Yeah, those larger epics are so hard. If you have any sort of historical, leanings or training or anything, the literature is great, what survives, but it's so hard to locate it in a particular time period sometimes or a particular cultural context, like really particular, so you can say something about what's going on.
Right.
So you make these guesses about like what effect they might have on the people who are hearing them, but you have to you really locate the audience more than you do the literature, and that interplay is really difficult sometimes.
Yeah, or bring in other disciplines and try to sort of talk about issues that are relevant but not quite reliant on hard facts in the same way or something like that.
Right. So it becomes a literary study more than a historical and cultural study. And you look at it as literature, which is fine to do. It's hard to figure out what's going on when they were written if you know when they were written.
I mean, we do know when they were written, basically.
Yeah.
It's just that, like for the Sanskrit epics, it spans centuries. So, that makes it harder to say super much, but you can still say some things.
Right. So can you talk about the role that poets in Rome and India played in political matters, especially critiquing political power?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that has been interesting to me in thinking about just empire in this period, because I think a lot of times when we come at it, when scholars come at it, we're coming at it from a modern perspective where we're thinking sort of with a post-colonial perspective. Okay, there were colonies and imperialists and this and that. But when you go back further in time, you sort of realize that, okay, yes, maybe there was an empire, but an empire meant sort of a far-flung set of peoples with very different cultures kind of melding together in different ways and not necessarily consistent ways. And it made it also interesting to think about what it meant for people who were deeply religious and who also started to grapple with what would happen if somehow the religion and the political aspects, the religious aspects and the political aspects started to meld. Mm-hmm. So when you start getting ideas about divinizing emperors, then theologically, you have to figure out some stuff very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And it also means that there are implications for the incompatibility of polytheism and monotheism in these periods. And so that, I think, is one of the big reasons why you have, some of that antagonism between Roman religions and Christianity and stuff.
Yeah. And the dynamic that kind of struck me as I was reading some of your work is the idea that poets are both patronized by rich people who were involved in the empire, but also critiquing them at the same time, and how does that play out in their work? And I know for some it plays out very badly.
Yeah, right. It's dangerous business. I mean, you have to toe a line. And I think, I guess I sort of think about it as whispering truth to power. I think these are guys who want to take some risks, but at the same time, they want to stay alive.
Yeah.
And they also have to sort of figure out, okay, but we also want to entertain. I mean, we're artists. We're not writing rhetoric in the same way. I mean, although Ovid happened to excel at rhetoric, I mean, he was really well trained in rhetoric, and he broke his father's heart because his father really wanted him to be a politician.
Yeah.
And he really just wanted to be a poet. And the world is better for that, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
But, someone like him who is patronized but is not part of the priestly class, like he's not in line to become one of the augurs or one of the people who is going to be in one of the sort of colleges of diviners or things like that. He's somebody who's deeply interested in religion. There's an incomplete work, the Fasti, that is a ritual calendar, basically, that covers 6 months of the year. And it's clear that, I mean, one of the things I tell my students when I teach this kind of material is in Rome, there was no difference between religion and politics. It was completely enmeshed. Those two things were completely interwoven. So, I mean, there's no incompatibility between different emperors occupying priestly roles before they ascend to the throne and things like this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things in my class is that one of the foundational differences between modern time, or at least modern North American culture, and ancient Christianity when I teach is that non-separation, or at least I don't think there's that much of a separation now in our culture between religion and politics, but or government. But at least there's the aspiration, in our founding documents that there shouldn't be this interaction. But back then they had no aspirations whatsoever. It was just part of a tapestry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something I'm interested in because I think especially growing up in an American context, it's something we learn in school. You don't mix church and state. You don't do these things. Whereas, once you start looking even at imperial England, you realize, oh, wow, okay, so the Anglican Church is headed by the king.
Yeah.
And that's what happens.
Yeah. And there's it's not just one part of the system that's different. It's a whole kind of cultural stance in a way that's different. And it's really hard for my students, at least, to kind of get their minds around that when we're reading religious texts and there's political dimensions to it, how that's not something that's unusual in the literature or the culture at the time, where it might be for us. It's a big thing for somebody who's religious to start talking about politics. And when the Pope and the president start arguing, that would have been a normal debate.
Yes, or you would have had, I mean, one of the ways I teach my students about the position of Pontifex Maximus is to say, well, who's the pontiff today? When we talk about pontiffs. And they sort of realize, oh, wow, so this person is also in line to be sort of the secular head as well, if you can even call it that.
So I want to talk about your current work that you're here on campus to talk about.
Okay.
So first of all, explain what you're doing with Ovid and Kalidasa and with their love poetry especially. Can you give a little synopsis of what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I realized, so in my first book, I was interested in sort of trying to categorize the different types of primary epics, these collectively authored epics. The distinction I made there was between affirmative epics and interrogative epics. It was just sort of an attitude toward whatever the central cultural ideal was. One set of epics. In each culture, there's an epic that basically sort of affirms it and is very triumphalist, and the other one is much more concerned about moral ambiguity and thinking about what it means to be not in the winner's position all the time and that kind of thing. Whereas I think when you start to contrast those epics with the individually authored epics, one of the things I noticed was that you have in both the Indian and Greek traditions, these strong normative epics. The norms are different in those cultures, but they both are very sort of concerned with inculcating a set of ideals so that their societies follow a certain way of life. Whereas I felt with the individually authored ones, there was much more room for emotional exploration, trying to think about how theology and psychology interact, trying to think about what it means to portray your gods as having foibles, as imperfect, as beings that had deep connections to humans, and sometimes ones that they didn't even understand or manage properly. Sort of stereotypically, the Greco-Roman gods are sort of notorious, right? You have these early Christian writers who are just sort of, not really very happy with them. But when you start to sort of look across polytheisms, you realize, oh, well, maybe there's some kind of work that's being served when you have these poets that are reinterpreting their own traditions and sort of saying, oh, well, I can, even though this god appeared in earlier epics, I can take that mythology, that existing mythology, and rework it so that I'm expressing something new about those gods that tells something about what it might mean to have a certain type of emotional life in my context. I think that's part of what I'm interested in, just how the idea of love gets used in a way to understand theological issues that are on these poets' minds in their own times.
Yeah, sounds great. We'll hear more about that tomorrow.
Yes. Working on that, yes.
So do you see any modern analogs to what Ovid and Kalidasa were doing with their poetry to critique political abuses of power?
I think you tend to see it with popular musicians.
Oh, interesting.
I was thinking about this, and I think someone like Bruce Springsteen comes to mind.
Yeah.
Someone who's basically sort of a bard, singing and writing poetry, but is reaching a large audience and opining on political issues of the day. That's where I think I see it the most strongly. It doesn't seem to me like people read that much anymore.
Yeah.
As far as just learning poetry, I think the value of memorizing poetry seems to have gone down in our culture a bit.
Yeah.
We still have, I guess another place where it comes out is sometimes in dramaturgy, like if you have adaptations of Shakespeare plays and things like that. So the plays are basically the same, but you can make a political statement by the way you cast it or the way you construct the sets or whatever spin you're putting on that particular interpretation of the play.
Yeah. Yeah, so my family and I went to see All the Villains Are Here, I think is the name of it. But it's a one-man show, one-man play that, and I can't remember the person who does this, but he has assembled all of the key scenes from Shakespeare's plays chronologically from beginning to end.
Oh, wow.
And goes through the way that villains are depicted and how Shakespeare has developed that character from a very flat sort of evil villain to somebody who's more morally complex by the end. And it was fantastic because he didn't just do this for the sake of it. He introduced each villain in each play to the audience and have commentary on it. But he set it up in such a way to make a very clear political statement about what's going on with our current president. And it was quite remarkable where he was an actor taking a playwright's work and very clearly translating it in such a way. He was performing the works word for word. It wasn't like he was doing anything different. And he had scenes that were, would have been sort of set in that time period. So it wasn't like it was a completely different context or anything, but he was still doing a remarkable job showing how these plays are still quite relevant for our contemporary situation.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think anything that gets especially newer audiences interested in these kinds of art forms, it just means that they'll survive, which is wonderful.
Yeah. And I don't know, the other thing that came to mind for me was the recent, I guess it might be a revival. I can't remember if this happened in previous time periods, but during the inauguration, having a poet give an original poem. And certainly they're not critiquing the incoming president, but at least having that interaction of poetry and poets with a political setting, the highest political setting in our country.
Yeah, that office of poet laureate is an interesting one. And we'll see that the current administration is interested in arts.
Yeah.
As we will see. So
at least, revising or renovating the art centers.
Yes. And so I think the look of DC is going to change a bit. We'll see.
Glittering in gold, right?
Something.
So we always ask our guests at the end about their advice for graduate students who are making their way through the world of graduate school, but even recent graduates. Because in the humanities, it's so difficult to get a job now. What kind of advice do you have for people going through humanities programs and then heading out into the world and maybe or maybe not getting an academic job,
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is adapt to your professional setting. We're having to do that. I mean, even those of us who have jobs, the way higher education is going right now, the landscape of what's out there is so different from what we thought we were getting into in graduate school, right? I mean, just the obstacles that we never foresaw are sort of coming to roost. And so I think having the ability to just kind of pivot in any situation where things are not quite what you expected is very, very useful. And that could look like a lot of different things. It might be some kind of alternative academic stuff. It might mean teaching at a secondary level versus higher education. It might mean maybe working in a library or publishing or, those kinds of things. But I think just sort of not being focused necessarily on one type of track, just thinking about preparing for any possibility, that comes your way professionally, I think is useful. Because sometimes, to be honest, a lot of times when you're in graduate school, you don't really know what the career is that you're preparing for. You don't really know what it means to have that job, and it might not be exactly what you pictured. So it's useful to just have different possibilities in mind. The second thing I would say is decide on what your personal priorities are. I think it's really important to figure out if there's certain things, certain obligations you have to your family, if there's certain places you want to live or don't want to live, if there's certain decisions, life decisions you need to make, like do you want to be a parent? There are certain things you have to decide at a certain age, otherwise they're not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes you lose sight of that, especially with these programs that go on and on and on, right?
Yeah.
And then the last thing I would say is protect your health.
Yeah. Protect
your health, because academia is the kind of profession that will not stop when it keeps taking things from you, right? It's just, there's no expectation that, it'll ever be enough, right? And so you have to set boundaries and you have to realize it can be extremely penny wise, pound foolish not to take care of yourself and sleep and eat right and take care of your mental health, your physical health, all those kinds of things. We don't think about it a lot, I think, when we're very young, because you can get away with stuff. It doesn't really start to affect you, I think, until you're older. And then you realize, oh, wow, it would have been good if I'd gotten into this routine when I was younger.
Yeah. No, I remember in graduate school, my wife, Pat, and I both went through at the same time. And we weren't old by any means, but we were in our 30s when we were in the thick of it. And a lot of the people coming through were in their mid-20s just doing whatever. And I was like, well, I can't really do that anymore. It was really helpful to have that kind of perspective. And the people who didn't make it through were the ones, had nothing to do with their academic ability. It was much more, could they navigate the emotional roller coaster and the games that you have to play and all the power dynamics and everything of graduate school. And the ones that made it through had a balanced life, and for better, for worse, or were able to kind of recognize those things and take care of themselves well enough to at least get through.
Mm.
But then you're right, afterwards, it's a different kind of demanding, but you think it's demanding in graduate school, and then you get a job.
You have no idea. No, this is the thing. If graduate students knew what these jobs entailed, maybe fewer of them would apply to graduate school. I don't know. I think even if you're having a bad day, if you still enjoy some part of what you're doing, or you realize, I would so much rather be doing this than getting dressed up and taking a train to a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah.
This is much, much more interesting.
Yeah. I keep telling my kids, it's on paper, academics is the best job in the world because you get paid to learn, you get paid to help other people learn, and your time is pretty flexible. It's a lot of work, but it can be really great if you get the right job and everything. But it can also be really hard and really demanding and really debilitating in some ways, depending on the context you're in and how perfectionist you are and how how much you want to do, because there is no boundary. And
it can vary within one career too. It's not, There's a lot that's unpredictable. And, as we've seen, there are things that are larger structural factors that are unpredictable as well.
Yeah, and you might end up doing something like podcasting,
Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
It's an educational activity. It's, intellectually enriching. I've been listening to some of the podcasts. It's been fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, now you're a part of it. Well, thanks so much for your time and joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. If you wish to support this podcast and the work of the Future of the Past Lab, click on the donate button on our website.